lesson tonight comes to us from the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. So this is one of those interesting passages of Scripture. It's a story in a story, right? And it's interesting. So it starts out, Jesus is hanging out, and Jairus, this leader of the synagogue, comes and says, "I need you to come heal my daughter." And so it's towards that journey that this story in a story happens. This woman who needs healed, and then Jesus deals with her and then continues on to deal with Jairus and his daughter. Right? So Jairus comes to him and he asks Jesus, "Come and touch my daughter so that she may be made well." Right? This notion of healing comes through touch. Whereas Jairus is asking for Jesus to touch his daughter, the woman comes and feels the need to sneak up and touch Jesus. Very different approach. For some reason, the woman felt she couldn't ask Jesus to touch her. Right? So we get this notion that, it's told to us she's had this disease for 12 years, and what it would have meant for her is that she was an outcast of the city, that actually no one could touch her because of her disease. If they touched her, they would be unclean and would have to go through all these rituals about what it meant to be clean, and so no one would touch her, and she was considered an outcast, which is why she may well have felt the need to just sneak up. And she says, if I can only just touch his cloak, I'll be healed. Knowing it only takes a touch. Something she hasn't felt in 12 years. How often and where in our society are people lacking touch? Who in this world are, for one reason or another, outside of the general population and don't feel the touch that could set them free? How many people? The interesting part of this story, part of it is, Jesus takes time with this woman. And in the taking of the time with the woman, Jairus' daughter dies. So Jesus, he doesn't just say, and just keep going. He spends the time with this woman who just needed to touch somebody. And then Jesus goes on from this encounter from the woman and does the very same thing to Jairus' daughter. He touches her and speaks to her, and she gets up and runs around and needs something to eat. I'm in touch with that, how that is. The power of touch. We were talking tonight in book study about the power of taking time to touch. Jesus takes time on both occasions in this story to touch somebody, to set somebody free, to give them what they need, to liberate them from the condition that they're in. I think we as Jesus followers are set out and sent out into the world to touch people. Interesting enough, what Jesus does here, one, being touched, two, touching the Jairus' daughter. Interesting fact, neither of the women have a name. I don't know what there is with that. Neither the woman nor Jairus' daughter. Just the father is named. Which means it could be anybody. They just needed Jesus to take the time to touch them. As we go out into the world, we're called to really find the people with whom we just need to give the time to. Right? We were talking, and I've said this before. It's a story I've told before, but let me tell it again. In seminary, we had students from Tanzania who were studying with us to get their Masters of Divinity to go back home and be pastors. And they would always chuckle at us Americans because they would say, the Tanzanians would say to us, it's interesting that you Americans all have watches, but you never have the time. And yet, we Africans don't wear watches, and we always have the time. And I'm like, wow, I don't know how many times I was convicted, and I would always go, oh, well, hey, Paul, look at the time. I got to go. It's time for class. Yeah, that how precious a gift it is we can give to somebody, to just give them time. So I think Jesus' example is, many times I will argue, it is more of a treasure to give our time than the action or resource that we may give them in that moment. It's the time that tells them they have value. It's the time that tells them, I see dignity in you. It's the time that is the healing moment that we share and build relationships, much less than what I can hand you or do from you. And so, we are called to live time differently. We didn't get to it in book study today, but maybe we should just all throw our watches out. I don't know. We'll start there, I guess. And as we were chatting, the first congregation I served in New Jersey, in Union, New Jersey, they were 99.9% native Caribbeans. So they were all from the islands. And everything was on island time. And we started when everyone was here. And we finished when it was time. And it frustrated me for a while. I'll confess to you. But until I realized what it, and so I'm mindful of that. And so many times, even last Sunday, we had our group that's going to New Orleans for the youth gathering. We spent the day together. And it was a little after 1, and people were rustling, and it's like, well, Pastor, are we going to start? And I said, are we complete? Is everybody that's going to be here here? And well, we're missing one, but they're on the way. Well, then we can take the time for them to be here before we start. And it's a question of, are we complete? Because to start when we're not complete says something. We should wait till we're complete, till everybody is here and begin. What if we lived life on, I don't know, the island of the kingdom of God time? I don't know what that even looks like. But so as we go out into the world, look at those moments you can take time. It only takes a moment most times to smile, to say thank you, to hold a door, to whatever that moment may be. Healing happens. Freedom happens. Grace and peace and love happen in those moments. Not only for others, but for us as well. Because we worship a God who always has the time for us.
When one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. You may be seated. So there's a lot going on here this morning in this gospel text. There's like a story and a story and then a story. And there's a little more than just healing going on. So Jesus is out and about doing his thing, and Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, comes up and says to Jesus, come and just touch my daughter and she'll be healed. And Jesus says, okay. So starts to go to Jairus' house. But then this woman who has had this disease for 12 years pushes her way, as Terry was telling us the little story, right? And just wants to touch his clothes. Doesn't even need Jesus to touch her. Just needs to touch his clothes. And she does, and immediately she's healed. 12 years. And Jesus feels the power of this moment and asks who did this, and eventually she tells him the whole story. And Jesus doesn't condemn her, but commends her for her faith. But then in this moment of healing, someone from the house comes and tells Jairus his daughter's dead. While Jesus was healing this woman, remember the story, he was on the way to the daughter. But yet this interruption happened. And now Jairus' daughter's dead. And Jesus says, let's go. And he gets there, and he puts everybody outside, and he touches the little girl and tells her to get up. She does. And then Jesus tells everybody that's in the room, not many, shh, don't tell anybody what happened here. Right? And then the story ends with Jesus telling her mother and father to give her something to eat. I think that's the coolest part of it all. Right? So, in both cases, both women needed healing. And Jesus heals both of them in the same way. He gives them two gifts, time and touch. He gives them time, and he gives them a touch. Right? The woman has 12 years had this disease. This disease, we know scripturally, she should not be in the city. She should be outside the city. No one's allowed to touch her. No one's allowed to talk to her. No encounter whatsoever. Because her touching Jesus, according to the law, would have made him unclean, and he couldn't go about doing what he needed to do. Jesus doesn't condemn her for it, commends her, breaking the law, so that she could be healed. Right? He takes a moment. Remember, he's going to Jairus' house, but he takes a moment with this woman and allows her to touch him so that not only be healed, but she can be set free. Because you see, in this moment, now, she can have human touch again. Now, she can have conversation with someone else. She's been set free, liberated, not just healed. Because Jesus took the time and offered a touch. Same thing with the little girl. Interesting enough, the little girl is 12 years old. The same amount of time this woman has had this disease. This woman has had this disease all this girl's life. Jesus does the same thing, right? He takes her by the hand, which according to the law, you're not allowed to do, of course. You're not allowed to touch dead people. And talks to her, tells her to get up. He takes the time. The people from the house told him, don't bother. Just keep walking on, walking on. But he takes the time and gives her a touch. And not only is she healed, she is liberated, set free. Because she too will be able to experience human contact again. She too will be able to have conversation and be part of something bigger than herself. It's more than just a healing. It's a freedom. Because someone, Jesus, took time to touch them. When I was in seminary, I told this story, but I'm going to tell it again. We had pastors from Tanzania who studied at Trinity, and they would always offer, it was not even a joke, it was a jab. And they would say, when the situation arose, you Americans are interesting. You all have watches, but never have the time. We in Tanzania don't have watches, but we always have the time. And it wasn't about the time on the clock they were talking about. Right? Of course, feeling convicted in the moment, I would always go, oh, look at the time. I gotta get to class. Look at that. Sorry. Right? How many times do we not take the time? A moment to smile, to engage, to just say hello. How many times do we not take time? The truth is, in taking that time, much like in these stories with Jesus, it may well set someone free. You see, take the time for someone. What you're saying to them is, you have value in this world. What you're saying is that I respect your dignity to not just ignore you. Jesus always takes the time, especially to touch. How many segments of our population do we refuse to touch? Now, the last several years, we had an excuse. Social distancing and everything. But who do we refuse to touch even before that? Who do we refuse to say, I respect your dignity enough to respect you as a human being? And share space, share a touch, shake a hand. In doing so, we set people free. It's more than just healing. It's liberation. It's freedom. It's acknowledging the humanity from one creature to another. And in doing so, each of us are healed. Right? Jesus knew power was happening in that moment. And it was a moment as much for Jesus as it was for the woman. It was a moment as much for Jesus as the daughter, as much for the mother and father as it was for anyone else in that room. I can imagine, even though Scripture doesn't tell us, that it didn't take long for that mother to touch that daughter before she went and gave her something to eat. Right? Jesus calls us to ministry of time and touch. We should always be willing to give the time. Right? Yeah. One of my seminary professors always told me, and I violate him every single week, but he says, never wear your watch in worship, because then you're not always looking at it to see what time it is. Right? Just let worship be worship. Like, yeah. So as we go out from this place into the world, where can we take the time to touch someone, to touch their life, to touch their existence, to show them they have value? It probably doesn't take too many steps outside these doors to make that happen. We worship a God who always has the time for us. We worship a God who is always willing to touch us where we are. We worship a God who is always present to lift up our dignity, to remind us of our humanity, and to encourage us to embrace our value in this world. We worship a God that uses us to heal the world. And we do that one moment and one touch at a time. And it starts with you. The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 5th chapter. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped. She felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O
Christ. You may be seated. So we have this interesting story this morning. It's actually a story in a story. A couple of healings going on. And so it starts out, he's just kind of out and about for the day. On the other side, remember we had the storm last week, so now he's on the other side of the lake. And one of the leaders of the synagogue, Jairus, comes up to him and says, "My daughter's sick. Would you please come and just touch her, and if you do, she'll be healed and made well." And Jesus says, "Sure." And then they go off. And while they're walking to Jairus' house, there's this woman who's had this disease for 12 years. And she's been under physician's care, spent all of her money, she's getting worse. And she's heard of Jesus and thinks to herself, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. I don't even have to have him touch me. I just want to touch his clothes. And so she pushes through the crowd and sneaks up behind him and just touches his cloak. And she is immediately healed of this disease that she's had for 12 years. Right? But Jesus feels the power go out of him, right? Everybody touch, everybody go, jazz hands. Oh, I don't know. I won't make it. It's all right. I was going to do it, and I'm like, they're not going to do it anyway. I'm like, why bother, right? Jazz hands. So Jesus feels the power go out of him, right? Who touched me? And the disciples, who touched me? There's 8,000 people here. But the woman comes forward and tells him the whole story. And he says to her, "Your faith has made you well. Go and be healed." And all that means. And in the midst of that moment, now remember, he's heading to Jairus' house. That's where they're going when this little moment happened. And so they show up from Jairus' house and tell Jairus, "Your daughter's dead." There's no sense for Jesus to come anymore. Well, Jesus goes anyway. And he throws everybody out of the house except mom and dad and 3 of his disciples. And Jesus touches the girl, holds her hand, and tells her to get up. And she does. And everybody's amazed. And the story ends, I think it's the coolest way to end a story. And Jesus tells mom and dad to get her something to eat. And I'm like, I like the way that story ends. Right? Go get something to eat. Give her something to eat, right? These powerful healing stories. I think there's a little more going on. But how does Jesus heal? With time and touch. Time and touch, right? Jesus took the time to encounter the woman, even though there was something else he was going to do. You know, you can imagine today would be, "Jesus, you got a minute?" And then, no, you see, I'm going to Jairus' house, daughter dying. give me a call. Shoot me an email, right? Text me, and I'll get back to you. Right? Yeah. But what does Jesus do? Jesus takes the time to be with her. Now, a little bit about the woman. She's had this disease for 12 years, which means, according to Scripture, she has not had human contact in 12 years. See, no one's allowed to touch her. No one is allowed to touch her because of her disease. She's probably an outcast. Probably hasn't had human conversation in 12 years. Right? So what Jesus does in that moment, right, is not only heal her, but Jesus sets her free. See, from this moment on, now she can have human touch again. She can have a conversation. Somebody can come up to her and engage her as a human being once again, which hasn't happened in 12 years. That's more than healing. That's restoring dignity. That's restoring humanity. That's liberation and setting somebody free, right? Because Jesus took the time to touch, right? So then the same thing goes to Jairus' house, even though they told him not to, right? And how does he heal Jairus' daughter? He takes her by the hand, touches her, right? Once again, according to Scripture, not allowed to do that. If you touch a dead body, you become unclean and you got to go through all these things and rituals and you can't do what you're supposed to do and then no one can touch you. See? Jesus is all about stepping over the human conventions, the rules, to give somebody time and touch. And he tells the girl, get up, and she does. Right? Once again, now this girl, from this moment on, can have human touch again. Now she can have conversation. She can embrace her humanity once again. He liberates her, sets her free, because he gave her time and touch. Right? The power of time and touch. Now, when I was in seminary, we had pastors from Tanzania who were studying with us and engaging in their theological education, and then they were going to go back home and be pastors. And they would, every once in a while, felt the need to, and it wasn't even a joke, it was a jab, an intentional jab. And every once in a while, they would say, you Americans, you all have watches, but you never have the time. And then they would continue. You see, in Tanzania, none of us wear watches, but we always have the time. Now, they're not talking about time on a clock. They're talking about having time. Right? You got the time? No. You know, usually when they would say that, when they would jab us like that, I'd go, oh, look at the time. I got to go to class. When do we not give somebody the time in our lives, in our world? Why do we not give somebody the time? We don't think they deserve it? Why do we do that? Jesus always gave the time to people who he encountered. Even those who were trying to do crazy things to him, he still gave them the time. Why don't we give people the time? Just a moment, right? Jesus heals with time and touch. So what, challenging question. Who won't you touch? What segments of our population won't you touch? Why? Right? time and touch, we come to understand, is about saying to somebody else, you have value. Your life means something. It allows somebody to have dignity as opposed to taking it away. Just by giving somebody the time, a moment, a smile, a word, a hello, a handshake, whatever it may be. To give somebody the time sets them free. That's how Jesus goes about the world, giving people time and touching them, even when rules say that you shouldn't. Even when human conventions say, you shouldn't talk to them, you shouldn't give them the time, you shouldn't touch them, don't be with them. Jesus disregards all that and sets people free. We worship a God who always gives us the time. Always. We worship a God who is always willing to reach out and touch us wherever we are, regardless of what is happening. We worship a God who is always working to instill dignity, to call us to our humanity, to remind us of the value we have and that we matter in this world. God uses us to go out into the world and to heal the world in the same way. With every minute, with every touch, with every encounter, we set people free. And if the Son has made you free, you are free indeed. So as we leave this place and begin the second half of our calendar year, tomorrow is July, if you can believe it, catch yourself when you think you don't have the time and wonder what God is trying to say to you in that moment. Catch yourself when you don't offer a touch and ask yourself what God is trying to say to you in that moment. Because God trusts each one of us to go out into the world, to be the change, to show God's love through time and touch to a world that needs to hear it and needs to know that they matter in this world and in the next.